Hey peeps, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today we're talking about the ever-painful moral argument for God's existence. It's actually a response video of sorts to Gavin Ortland's video on the moral argument, but the responses I give apply to the moral argument itself more generally. The response video was originally hosted on Swan Sona's channel, which I've linked in the description. Many thanks to Swan for letting me re-upload, and let's just dig in.
Before we get in, I probably just want to say some nice words about Gavin, just because, we're challenging some of the arguments that he's presenting, but I think that's helpful to get rid of our tribalistic kind of impulses. So, I mean, just one thing that I want to say is that Gavin has always been like super kind to me. So I really do appreciate that. What's really cool and what many people probably don't know is that he often reaches out to those who he disagrees with him before making a video on a given topic. So he like reaches out to me, for instance, if he wants to make a video on like ontological arguments or this moral argument one. And I really appreciate that. And then the final thing is that I appreciate his kind of, non-tribalistic, his irenic demeanor. And I wish people, including myself, emulated it more. So yeah, that's what I want to say at the outset.
Okay, let's talk about the moral argument. This is the argument for God's existence from morality. This is maybe the most popular way, as we'll talk about, to try to prove God. But I've noticed it's becoming increasingly common for people to be very confident that we don't need God to explain morality. You hear this a lot. Recently, I was watching Joe Schmid respond to Trent Horn, who was himself responding to Stephen Woodford. And this was the topic of discussion, morality and God. Joe was basically saying you don't need God to explain morality. Non-theists can perfectly well ground moral truths in the intrinsic nature of things and character of things and so forth. And he recommended an article in the journal Mind, which develops that view. Now, Joe is a smart guy. Check out his YouTube channel, Majesty of Reason. I'll link to that. So I took this to heart, and I thought I want to read this article, which I read, and I want to summarize it in this video, as well as some other articles on the same topic. Basically, after that, I emailed some other atheist friends that I respect and said, tell me about this. What are the ways, what are the contemporary top options? What are the leading ways that academic philosophers ground morality other than in God? And several people were very helpful, as was Joe, in sort of inundating me actually with resources. So I've been reading and diving into this. And along the way, I came across this statement from the philosopher Quentin Smith, who said the idea that morality is founded by God is rejected as nonsensical by all 20th century moral philosophers, be they theists or atheists. So
okay, you can pause it.
I thought that's
all right.
Okay, so yeah, there are a few things to say. So, I mean, Quentin Smith there is, I'd have to see the context. I suspect it's hyperbole, but if it's not hyperbole, then of course, his claim is mistaken. It's not rejected by all. I mean, you can go back to the quote if you want, like maybe back 5 seconds. It's certainly not rejected as nonsensical by all 20th century moral philosophers. It actually would have been accurate to say almost all, but it's not accurate to say all. I mean, William Olson counts certainly as a 20th century moral philosopher, and he certainly doesn't fall into this camp, along with some others. Alvin Plantinga, etc. Okay, so that's one thing to say. The second thing to say is that, at the beginning he was saying like a lot of people seem to be pretty confident that the argument fails, and let's try to test that confidence. And now maybe we can go over to my notes, because I do just maybe want to give the audience a brief glimpse into just some reasons why I myself am not the biggest fan of moral arguments, or at least deductive moral arguments. As I say here, there are like more reasons besides, and you can see the resource document that Swan will probably link maybe after our discussion or at some point. He'll link a kind of resource document that I put together for people in the description.
Joe, it's there now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, sweet. So it's currently in the description, and maybe how's it going? Maybe I'll also put in the description, or ask you to put in the description the notes that I'm going through right here, so people can have access to them. Okay, so yeah, so I mean, one of my central problems for like deductive moral arguments is that, I mean, I just have to be honest with you. This is just a confession of how things seem to me. It just seems patently clear to me that, say, excruciating suffering is bad because of its intrinsic character, and not because it bears some mysterious relation to a being outside of space-time. In my view, if you remove that being from the picture, excruciating suffering will still retain its kind of negative phenomenological character, the way that it feels, which to me seems entirely sufficient on its own to account for its badness. Now, maybe others don't share this intuition, but it's just one of the main reasons why I don't find deductive moral arguments plausible. It's just that some moral truths just seem to me clearly explained non-theistically. So that's one of the main reasons. I guess a second reason is like we'll talk about this more later, but I do think a lot of the kind of explanatory challenges that moral arguers pose to the non-theist can equally be posed to the theist. And basically whatever the theist says can be parodied with just as much plausibility by the atheist, it seems to me. So we can equally ask, what explains or grounds God's goodness, right? In virtue of what is God good? And it seems to me that there are only like three kind of plausible answers here. First, you could say nothing. God's goodness is just a kind of fundamental feature of reality. There's nothing in virtue of which God is good. This is just kind of at the rock bottom of reality. Then one thing to say is that, well, then you don't actually have an account or explanation of morality. Instead, you're taking some moral fact as just primitive, as bedrock, namely that God is good. So this actually doesn't give an explanation of morality. It doesn't give an account of morality. And also, then, the non-theist can make essentially the same move. They can just say, well, maybe, some fundamental moral principle is that, pleasure is good and pain is bad, or, virtue is good and vice is bad, or other sorts of things like that. And there's no deeper explanation of that. It's just a kind of primitive foundational aspect of reality. And it seems like the theist doesn't have grounds to object to the atheist who makes that move, because the theist himself, under this one of the dilemma, is likewise saying that God's goodness is primitive. There's nothing in virtue of which God is good. So that's that one of the dilemma. I think a second thing, another plausible answer that one might say is that, we could just make a bare appeal to God's nature. So like what it is to be God just is to be good. Why is water H2O? Well, just listen, what it is to be water is to be H2O. There's nothing further to say apart from appealing to the essence of water in that case. And likewise, we can appeal to the essence of God to explain why God is good. But then the non-theist can make the exact same move. And this is basically what Bengtson, Cuneo, and Schaefer-Landau themselves do. They say, why is, for instance, causing immense suffering for an innocent person for no compensating benefit? Why is that bad? Well, just what it is to be wrongness and what it is to cause that kind of immense suffering, that just explains why causing that sort of suffering is wrong, or why it's bad. So the non-theist can likewise just make the exact same move. What it is to be pleasure is in part to be a mental state, but also in part to be good. What it is to be virtue, what it is to love someone is in part to do something good, etc. So I think the non-theist can then make the exact same appeal to essentialist facts. And again, Bengtson, Cuneo, Schaefer-Landau, we're going to get to this. They make this exact kind of account. And then I think the third way that theists could go here, or that I shouldn't say theists, I should say moral arguers. The third way that moral arguers can go is they can appeal to like substantive divine attributes, like God's love and his justice and his kindness and his mercy, right? So the idea here would be, in virtue of what is God good? Well, he's got these various attributes. He's loving and he's just and he's merciful and he's got all these features, and it's in virtue of having those attributes that God is good. But then I say, the non-theist can make the exact same move, why are people around us good? Well, because they're loving and they're just, or at least they're loving to a certain extent and they're just to a certain extent, and so on. Why are certain actions good? Well, because they manifest love, they manifest justice, they bring about justice, etc. So again, the non-theist can then make the exact same sort of explanatory move by accounting for the goodness of various actions and people and states of affairs in terms of their love and their justice and their kindness and so on. So it seems like the only plausible ways for the moral arguer to go at this juncture can just equally be co-opted by either render the moral arguer lacking an account of morality, or else can be such that they're equally plausible moves for the non-theist to make in giving an account of morality. And so the moral arguer can't say that the non-theist doesn't have an account of morality. We can compare the merits of the relevant accounts, we can bring in the total evidence about God's existence, but just in terms of this argument, I don't see how the theist has an edge over the non-theist. So anyway, that's a second reason, and I know I'm talking a little bit, but this is all going to be helpful for setting the stage later on. I guess a third reason why I'm not very inclined towards moral arguments is that there are kind of refined, more recently developed versions of the Euthyphro dilemma, aspects of which we will cover later on. So we're not going to go into this now, but I do think there are some moves in the space of a refined kind of Euthyphro problem that I think can have some force, at least in certain contexts. Okay, so that's a third point. And then I guess the fourth point that I want to make, and this one takes a little bit of spelling out, but I'll stick to the notes here. It's just that there really is a panoply of non-theistic explanations of morality that the moral arguer would need to kind of systematically proceed through and rule out. And no one has successfully undertaken that monolithic task. Just as a brief survey of some of the potential groundings of why certain actions have the moral properties that they do, are things like, some people have proposed facts about what would or wouldn't maximize well-being. That's a kind of utilitarian account. There are facts about the essences, the relevant moral properties in the relevant act, as in kind of like essentialist accounts. Facts about universalizability. So for example, whether one could, in performing the act, consistently will that everyone does the act, as in certain Kantian accounts. Other Kantian accounts ground an act's moral properties and whether the act treats someone as a mere means rather than an end in themselves. Contractualist accounts explain the moral properties of actions in terms of whether the principles allowing the act would be justifiable to others in a fair decision situation. Virtuethical accounts ground the moral features of acts in terms of whether the act is one a virtuous person would do, or in whether it expresses a virtuous disposition, or in the case of wrongful acts, a vicious disposition. Care ethics accounts basically substitutes in care for virtue there. There's lots of literature on care ethics. Ideal observer accounts explain the moral features of actions in terms of whether an ideally situated observer would approve of the act. Peter Rilton's naturalistic account explains the moral features of acts in terms of objective facts concerning the maximal fulfillment of idealized desires, which are basically what individuals would want themselves to desire if they had access to all the relevant information about the situation they find themselves in. William Regg has an account on which the moral features of acts are grounded in universalizable presuppositions that underpin discourse between persons. This is often called discourse ethics. Still, other people appeal to a plurality of the aforementioned potential grounds, or in particular facts about actions on a case-by-case basis. These are kind of called particularist accounts. There are natural law accounts that you were mentioning, which explain the moral features of actions in terms of whether they could be developed in different ways, but like whether they contravene the ends built into one's nature, or whether they like frustrate the function of a faculty or power, something like that, and so on. Like this is just a handful. I guess as Kevin Sharp rightly notes, with respect to like non-theistic, moral, realist accounts of morality, there are literally dozens of theories of moral values and moral duties that are objective, not naturalist, and make no appeal to gods. And then he just gives this litany of people: G. Moore, William Ross, Christine Korsgaard, Thomas Scanlon, Derek Parfit, etc. And again, like the moral arguer is the one who's saying, like, if God doesn't exist, then there's no objective, at least a standard moral argument. They're the one who's saying that if God doesn't exist, then there's no objective morality. So the onus is on them to systematically proceed through these accounts and show that none of them could be the case under atheism. And no one has undertaken that task. It's not enough to retort when faced with these various accounts. It's not enough to retort, well, why should I accept one of these accounts? Oh, you're just floating these as possibilities. Again, the burden of justification is on the moral arguer. They're the one who's making the positive claim that you can't have morality under atheism, right? So the onus is on them to rule out these sorts of accounts. They need to give us positive reasons to think that absolutely none of these accounts could be the case if theism is true. Again, at least if they're running the kind of standard deductive moral argument. Now, before I end this little spiel, this should not be, again, the accounts that I've just been giving should not be confused with questions about like the nature or identity of the moral properties themselves. So like there is a distinction between, so take the property of redness. There's a difference between explaining why something is red and giving an account of what the property of redness itself is, right? There's a distinction there. Like I can explain why a stop sign is red in terms of machines that painted it or whatever, and its underlying chemical composition and whatnot. But then, there's a separate question of like, well, what is the property of redness? And then we can investigate that. So like, we should be careful that there are some theistic ethics which can accept, some of these accounts, because these accounts are explaining why things have the moral properties that they do. But those versions of theistic ethics just give a different account of what the moral properties themselves are. Okay, so I want to keep that in mind. But I do think 2 points can be made here in sort of response to that point. One is that these accounts that I just mentioned can also be used to give an account of what the moral properties themselves are by saying that the moral properties simply consist in the relevant properties adverted to in these accounts. And even if we don't, and the second point is that even if we don't go this first route, we could instead say that there's no deeper story to tell about what the moral properties themselves are. They are sui generis, irreducible kinds of properties. But I myself don't really see why that's a problematic account of what the moral properties themselves are. And moreover, it seems no worse to me than the moral arguer's account of what the moral properties are, because I'm not going to go through the reasoning here, but they also ultimately have to reach a kind of bedrock sui generis, irreducible kinds of properties here, lest they reduce properties ad infinitum. So I'll leave it at that. Anyway, those are 4-ish reasons why I and many others don't find standard moral arguments convincing. As I said, there are many more reasons in addition to these, and I advise people to check the document linked in the description. So apologies for taking up so much time, but I wanted to at least situate the audience of where I'm coming from and why at least many people don't find moral arguments terribly plausible.
And I'll just say very quickly, Joe, as I switch to back to the video, and also I apologize because I just went 5 seconds forward and this is where it ended up. So I don't mean to have an unflattering image of Gavin. Growing up hearing the moral argument from Craig, I didn't really hear that many non-theistic accounts of moral realism. Often what I just heard was quotes from like Nietzsche or just like other atheists who were like nihilists and, rejected moral realism.
Yeah.
And it kind of gave me a skewed image. Then again, you have a lot of edgy undergraduate atheists who are like, yeah, there's no morality, bro, or it's all relative. And I'm like, okay, that's not a fair sampling of the views out there.
Right. We're going to get into this later. But that's part of my story as to why the moral argument is so effective for people. It's because and this is not their fault. I mean, I don't know what's going on in contemporary computer science, but it's not lay people's fault that they are completely unaware of what's going on in metaethics and normative ethics. But I think that's the explanation for why the moral argument is so popular. But anyway, we'll get to that.
All right, we are at 1.25 speed, so just a heads up.
An overstatement, is that true? So I do a dive into the academic literature on this topic, reading a bunch of these philosophy journals to basically figure out journal articles to figure out, what's the alternative and see if this is true. I was pretty shocked by what I discovered. Fascinating. I want to lay it out for you in this video. But I hope this will be helpful. What you'll get if you watch this video from start to finish is basically just an introduction to what might be the central point of clash regarding what is probably the most popular argument for God's existence right now. So we'll go in 3 steps. First, I'll just introduce the moral argument and identify and ward off some popular misunderstandings about it. That way, people just joining in can come up to speed. Second, I'll survey the current academic responses that Joe mentioned, that article, as well as several others. And then finally, I'll offer 2 reasons why I don't find those alternatives compelling, and I think God remains the best explanation for morality. So first, just an overview of the argument. It argues that God is the best explanation for objective moral values and duties. You'll hear these 2 words, values relating to moral goodness, duties or obligations relating to...
And yeah, you can go back like 5 or 10 seconds so people don't hear my interruption. So very briefly, I just want to note here that we do have to distinguish between different kinds of moral arguments. That is important. Some moral arguments simply say that they're like abductive. They're saying, well, God's the best explanation of morality, or God gives the best account of morality, or something like that. And that's very different from the kind of standard deductive moral argument, which is not abductive. So Craig will typically put the argument in this far stronger way, saying that atheism entails moral anti-realism, that there are no kind of objective facts about morality. Now, that is the sort of argument that is much more popular than the logically weaker abductive version, which simply says that God is the best explanation for morality. That abductive version does not say that if atheism is true, then there are no objective moral facts. So I wanted to get that distinction. I wanted to highlight that for the audience. There are different kinds of moral arguments. And we can continue with Gavin.
You'll hear these 2 words, values relating to moral goodness, duties or obligations relating to moral rightness. The key word here is objective. The way William Lane Craig describes this is that even if the Nazis had won World War II and taken over the world and killed or brainwashed everyone who dissented, it would still be true that the Holocaust was wrong. The Holocaust is wrong, even if 100% of living human beings think it was right, it's still wrong. That's objective morality. Basically, moral values and obligations exist independently of human variegating opinion. So this is a form of what we call moral realism, which is kind of a broader term that...
So Craig, I just want to note this for the audience. Craig has a very idiosyncratic usage of objective, and it's kind of tailored so that his view counts as objective morality. But actually, many professional metaethicists would argue that Craig actually has a subjectivist view of morality because, or at least of deontic moral properties, so properties of obligation, of oughtness and whatnot, because he makes them dependent on someone's stances, on someone's, namely God's stances, right? So they depend on some kind of observer. Even if it's an ideal observer, it's still some kind of observer. And at least standardly in metaethics, objective morality is taken to be morality that is independent of anyone's stances, whether actual or hypothetical, or even if it's an ideal observer or an ideal agent. So I do want to note that. At least be careful when we're saying objective and stance independent. Craig has a very idiosyncratic usage. And I mean, Craig tries to say, like, well, like, even if we all thought that, the Nazis' actions were okay, they still wouldn't be okay. And so that indicates that they're independent of us. I also think we could say, like, well, even if per impossibile, God thought the Nazis' actions were okay, they still wouldn't be okay. And so, I mean, if that indicates that they're independent of us, I think that that indicates that they're independent of God's stances. I think you can run that same sort of test in God's case. Now, one might try to say that, well, in God's case, that's like a counter possible. So you're imagining a situation in which is actually impossible. Now, I actually think we can perfectly well reason about these sorts of counter possibles. There is some controversy there, though, that I want to note. But also, I don't think if you could appeal to counter possibles to save kind of Craig's view here, imagine that the atheist said, well, actually, it turns out to be impossible for the Nazis to have won. Maybe they're a necessitarian and they think that the actual world is the only possible world. Would that be a good response to the objection that, like, even if we had all thought that it's okay, then it would not still have been okay? Is that a good response on behalf of the subjectivist to just say that, well, no, that's actually not a possibility? That you're engaging in counter-possible reasoning. No, that would not be a good response. I think this is still a good objection to a kind of subjectivism, that it still seems really plausible that if the Nazis had won and we had all come to think, even per impossibile, according to this necessitarian view, even if per impossibile we had all come to think that, putting people in gas chambers is okay, it still wouldn't have been okay. That still seems really plausible, and that seems to be a problem for the subjectivist account. And that's not assuaged by the fact that someone is taking this to be a necessary truth that we're considering counter possible. And so similarly, I think we should make the exact same move in Craig's case. So I actually think that this is a problem for Craig. But we don't need to go into that because counter possible reasoning admittedly does get into weeds very, very quickly.
And I don't want to bring a flamethrower to maybe just this conversation, but the conquest of Canaan and kind of Craig's use of divine command theory there.
Oh. Right. Yeah. Oh, no, exactly. No, I like that response too, because the standard response to what I was saying is like, well, that's a counter possible. God would never command that.
Yeah.
But then it's like, bro, have you read the Old Testament? And not just read the Old Testament, but have you read it through the kind of standard evangelical lens with which Craig reads it? Seems like God can command those sorts of things. Like, go and use your kind of, Bronze Age tools or whatever, your blunt weapons, and just like bash the heads of babies so that their heads are just bleeding out onto the floor, and do that to all the people, just systematically wipe out the entire land. The babies will get heaven. So anyway, so yeah, I don't even think the counter possible objection works because of that, because it's like, well, actually, no, it seems like that's not beyond God's ability to command. But anyway, let's continue.
All right.
Negating opinion. So this is a form of what we call moral realism, which is kind of a broader term that you will find used with a little bit of variation, but basically it's the view that at least some moral claims are telling us the truth about reality. There are some moral facts. At a more popular level, a colloquial way to say it is simply say good and evil do exist. They're out there. They're not just a human construct. Okay, why do I say this is the most popular argument for God? I've always found it fascinating. Why people bank on this argument so much. Part of that, I think, just relates to this ancient intuition that the moral realm and the realm of religion are intricately linked. Man, I'm filming this at night, and it's the end of a long day. I'm very tired. Sometimes I'll watch my old videos and I'll see myself misspeaking. It's the most frustrating feeling because you can't go and change it. Anyway, hopefully if I say something wrong, hopefully the point will still be clear. But there's this ancient intuition that the realm of the conscience has to do with the divine. So it's tapping into that. But it's not just that. The actual argument is employed by some of the greatest philosophers as the most effective argument. It really is interesting to wonder, especially historically. People like Thomas Aquinas don't use the moral argument as much, but contemporary philosophers do. C.S. Lewis, the book Mere Christianity, that book may be the single greatest apologetics book of recent times, at least in terms of copies sold, And it's amazing to me that Lewis does not give a cumulative case when he's arguing at the beginning for God's existence. He just puts all his money on the moral argument. That's the whole start of the book, just a moral argument. Elsewhere, we're familiar with his famous statements about how a man does not know a crooked line unless he can compare it to a straight line, and so forth. William Lane Craig, probably the most influential living Christian apologist, has stated that he thinks the moral argument is the most effective argument right now. And he puts it simply like this in this
Let's
syllogism.
pause
You
this.
can pause the
Let's
video
pause
and read,
here.
or you
So I very briefly wanted to comment on this. So in my estimation, I I admit to not having solid empirical evidence for this. I haven't done the studies, but this is one of my strong suspicions. In my estimation, the reason why the moral argument is so effective, this is my hypothesis, is I think there are two main reasons. I mean, I think the one main reason is just like, yeah, as we were saying earlier, people are typically entirely unaware of what's going on in metaethics and normative ethics, so they aren't typically aware of the panoply of ways to explain morality apart from God. That's my debunking explanation for the success of this argument with many people. But also, I think maybe a secondary factor is that, and maybe this is the case, I don't know, but people are, at least often, originally taught morality within a religious context and a kind of religious upbringing. And so I think people might mistakenly think that they have to shed that morality if they shed that kind of religious context, as many people have done, like the rise of the nuns, as it were, the N-O-N-E, the people who are not religiously affiliated. And so when you come to them and you recognize that, these people are kind of seemingly committed to objective moral truths, when you point out, like, they think that it's wrong to discriminate against people, even if we all thought that it was okay. When you point that out, and yet nevertheless they're an atheist, and they have some kind of cognitive dissonance there, because they mistakenly think that in shedding their religious commitments, they have to shed the moral commitments that they kind of grew up being taught within that religious context. So I guess that's a second kind of secondary explanation that I would offer for the effectiveness. Neither of these advert to the success or overwhelming force of the argument. So that's my hypothesis, at least.
You can check the video description. I'll put a great article he has written on this argument. Let me play a little clip of Alvin Plantinga, who's another leading Christian philosopher on the moral argument.
Well, the moral argument, a lot of people, I guess I would be among them, are very strongly inclined to think that if there weren't any such thing as God, you might say a divine lawgiver, then there really wouldn't be any such thing as moral obligation, genuine moral obligation. It's being the case that you really ought to do something or else really ought not to do that thing. There wouldn't be any such thing if there weren't such a person as God. But clearly there is moral obligation. So I would say anyway, and so lots of people would think. So if you think those two things, then you've got another argument for the existence of God.
Part of the strength of the moral argument is it appeals to something that is so visceral within us. It touches a real human emotion. The realm of conscience is this unique and powerful human experience. There are particular feelings associated with morality that are hard to even explain. People talk about deep conscience as the realm we argue from rather than argue for, where we just know certain things are right and wrong. For example, if you were to try to explain morality to someone who's a sociopath, you would quickly discover how difficult it is to kind of give them categories if they don't already have that experience. There's feelings of guilt and obligation and authority and even transcendence that go on in the moral realm, and the moral argument is tapping into all of that. If you're wanting to get a fully laid out moral argument, you can see my book, Why God Makes Sense in a World That Doesn't. It's 4 chapters. One of the 4 chapters is on the moral argument. I try to lay it out, and I try to give attention to those kind of emotional considerations in a fair way, I hope, so that if that might be of interest if you want to get a full case. This is a great book I'll put up of the history of this argument, which is another fascinating question I've kind of already alluded to, by David Baggett and Jerry Walls. And why maybe the moral argument might be more powerful in some cultures than others. Fascinating question. But here I'll just quickly want to try to address 3 popular level misunderstandings. We just have to get these out of the way first because they crop up over and over and over. Number 1, people tend to confuse the ontological ground for morality with epistemological questions about how we know morality. Ontological has to do with the order of being. Epistemology has to do with the order of knowing. So the moral argument is appealing to the first of those, not the second. It's dealing with that. So when people say things like, oh, we don't need a holy book or the Bible or religion to tell us about the difference between right and wrong, we can get that from reason or science or something like that. Whether that's true or not, it is irrelevant to the moral argument. The moral argument isn't saying anything about how we know morality, or like if we need special revelation to know morality or something like that. It's just addressing what we call a meta-ethical question about the nature of morality itself. What is the ontological ground for morality itself? Why are good and evil there? Okay, that's the question. However you might know about them, what are they doing there? That's the question. Another common response is people will say, this might be the most rhetorically effective and common response is people will say, but look at all the bad things that religious people do. Or they might say, but there's lots of secular people who are great moral people. And again, I know this is kind of basic, but I find it helps to say these things. Whether that's true or false, I think as a Christian, you can find lots of great things about atheists and lots of bad things about religious people. I wouldn't really dispute this too much, depending on how it's stated. But the basic point is it just has nothing to do with the moral argument. The moral argument is not that theists are more moral. That's not the argument. It's about where morality itself comes from. Okay, so it's not a sociological question. It's an ontological question. The third very common response is the so-called Euthyphro dilemma. This is one of Plato's dialogues where one of the characters asks, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious? Or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? And here, very quickly, if you translate this into like a monotheistic context, you can see why both horns of this dilemma are going to have a series of problems. For the first one, God is not really then the standard for morality. There's something external to God that he is looking to that makes him love that which is moral. But then on the second horn of the dilemma, morality becomes arbitrary. So, but now I won't address that objection here because I have a whole video on this. And I think basically philosophers like Robert Adams and others have dealt decisively with this. The dilemma fails because it makes you choose between two non-mutually exhaustive options. In a kind of Judeo-Christian theistic worldview, moral values and duties are grounded in the character of God himself. God is goodness. And that proposal avoids both horns of the dilemma. Now, there's a lot more to that.
Okay, let's
Of course,
pause
people
it.
have points of pushback to that, but you can see my other video on that. I'm just trying to...
So his the first 2 points that he made, so he's correcting 3 kind of, popular talking points. The first 2 ones he made are absolutely spot on. His responses succeed. I have nothing to say. This third point is what I want to get to. And so can we go over to my notes now? Okay. So he's here trying to split the horns of the Euthyphro dilemma. Now, I'm not yet sold that this really solves the Euthyphro dilemma for a number of reasons. Now, I'm also not entirely sold on the Euthyphro dilemma. I mean, I think there are some, like I said at the beginning, like there are versions of it in certain contexts that I think have a place and that I think can be plausible and pose a challenge. But I'm not here to claim that this is like some slam dunk argument that at least some people on the internet make it out as being. I just want to pose this as at least a challenge that people need to think much more deeply about. So that's kind of my purpose here. And I'm in particular, what I want to say here is that I'm not yet sold that Gavin's response here actually solves the Euthyphro dilemma. So regardless of whether or not the Euthyphro dilemma can be solved in other ways, I'm not yet sold that his way of solving it actually does solve it. With the necessary caveat that I do have to say that he mentioned another video of his that I have not yet watched. Okay, so maybe Gavin goes into this in that video. I have to fully admit that I have not yet watched that video. Okay, so I mean, one thing as a parenthetical aside, philosopher Jeremy Koons has a nice article wherein he criticizes exactly this response from Robert Adams. And the paper is relatively recent. Well, when I say relatively recent, I mean compared to when Robert Adams was really mostly writing about the divine command theory stuff and the divine kind of resemblance theory or whatever. The paper that I'm talking about here from Koons is called "Can God's Goodness Save the Divine Command Theory from Euthyphro?" Just search that title. A PDF of it is available online. Okay, so here are some of the reasons why I am not yet sold that Gavin's response of saying that God is the good or God is goodness or whatever, I'm not yet sold that solves the dilemma. So I guess one thing to say is that it's not clear to me that it actually avoids the horn of the dilemma on which goodness is arbitrary, or at least the kind of reasoning that goes on in that horn of the dilemma. So because I mean, after all, we still can wonder, why is God, who is goodness, why is he identical to these properties, like the properties of kindness and lovingness and mercy and justice, and so that those things could be good, instead of God being identical to these other properties, like malice and hatred and willing that others suffer for their own sake and selfishness, etc. So there is still this lingering worry about arbitrariness and a kind of lack of explanation for the goodness of kindness and lovingness and mercy and so on. So that's one thing that I want to say. The second point is that arguably the Euthyphro dilemma just re-arises for this proposal, because we can still ask, are kindness and lovingness, etc., good because they're identical to God, who is goodness? Or are kindness and lovingness, etc., identical to God, who is goodness, because they are each good? And so they're going to be identical to God, who is goodness itself. If the former, well then why these various features are good seems just as arbitrary as when we originally supposed that they were good because God approves of them. I mean, right before the arbitrariness worry was at least partly the following. Had God commanded against love, perhaps per impossibile, love would have been wrong. And now the worry is partly the following. Had God been identical to hatred instead of love, per impossibile, well then hatred would have been good. or right, or whatever, however you want to put it. So that's under the former horn of the dilemma, on which we say that kindness and lovingness, etc., are good simply because they're identical with God. But on the other horn of the dilemma, on which we say that these various features are identical with God because they're good. On that horn, these properties are identical to God because they're good. Well, then the fact that these properties are good is explanatorily prior to facts about their connection with God, meaning that we once again have normativity or morality, so some kind of moral facts, explanatorily prior to facts about God. So arguably, the Euthyphro dilemma, at least this is one of my worries, the Euthyphro dilemma may very well re-arise for this proposal. And then here's another way in which the Euthyphro dilemma might re-arise for Gavin's response. It would begin by noting that there are more robust forms of the Euthyphro dilemma, for instance, from Russ Schaeffer-Landau, cast in terms of reasons. And the general idea there is that either there are reasons that God commands what he does, or there aren't. If there aren't, well, then rightness turns out to be arbitrary. There's literally no reason undergirding why the things that are right. By contrast, if there are reasons why God commands as he does, well, then it seems like it's like these reasons and not the commands which do the explanatory heavy lifting when it comes to rightness. And so likewise then, this is at least a challenge. The challenge is that it seems like we can equally argue that either there are reasons that God is identical to the properties of lovingness and kindness and justice and mercy and so on, or there aren't. If there are such underlying reasons, well, then the goodness, if there aren't such underlying reasons, well, then the goodness of these various features might seem arbitrary. And if there are such underlying reasons, well, then it may seem that it's these deeper reasons, not their bare identity with God or intimate connection with God, that seem to do the explanatory heavy lifting when it comes to explaining their goodness. The fact that they're identical with God doesn't seem to explain their goodness in this case. Again, I'm not really here claiming that these different forms of the Euthyphro objection succeed. Instead, and this is crucial, my point is just that Gavin's response doesn't seem to adequately solve the Euthyphro problem, since the same sort of problem seems to re-arise, or at least you can make a case for it re-arising, for Gavin's own proposed solution. In other words, if one wants to solve the problem, it seems one will have to adopt some other sort of solution to the Euthyphro dilemma. And then I guess one final point here is that it is worth noting that there are other potential problems for Gavin's solution. So for instance, here are some other potential problems. Notice that I say potential problems. I'm not here claiming that these are like knockdown objections. There's a lot to say about these things. So one such problem is that it seems like creatures and worldly states of affairs have or instantiate goodness, but they don't seem to have or instantiate God, right? So it may seem that something is true of goodness, which isn't true of God. And if that's true, then the two couldn't be identical. Also, if properties are constituent parts of their possessors, in line with a kind of Aristotelian constituent ontology, well then, since some creatures have the property of goodness, it seems like goodness must be part of creatures. Again, if we have that kind of somewhat popular constituent ontology. But of course, God can't be a part of creatures. And so, again, it seems that God can't be identical to goodness, because something's true of one that isn't true of the other. Now, again, I'm not saying here that these objections are decisive. There are ways to push back. My point is just that there are additional worries that Gavin would need to address if he wants us to adopt his solution to the Euthyphro dilemma. Okay, so I guess the overarching takeaway of my response to what Gavin says about the Euthyphro dilemma here is that responding to the Euthyphro problem is not as smooth sailing as Gavin at least seems to want you to believe. Okay, so that's my main takeaway.
Canvas why I'm not going into that here. Here I want to pursue something a little more specific. Now that we kind of have a basic orientation to what the moral argument is, let's ask the question, when people say, oh, you don't need God for objective morality, there's all kinds of options on the table. There's all kinds of people who are moral realists, who affirm objective moral values and duties, who don't believe in God. Let's work through some of the literature and see what those options are. So the first article I read is this article in the journal Mind that was referenced in the video I mentioned by Joe Schmid. And I'll never forget reading this. I was at the hospital in Santa Barbara with my daughter. She'd broken her hip, so I was there for a long time. I had lots of time for extra reading. I love reading philosophy. Philosophy was my first love in terms of learning and study. When I was in college, I was a philosophy major. And then I kind of went more into theology, but I've always kind of missed philosophy and wanted to so I'll try to stay sharp and read and dip into little projects now and again. And so I'm really curious, what are these other grounds for moral realism other than theism that are just so ubiquitous, we are told? Well, one of the things I appreciated about this article is that they note that it's not enough to simply say the basis for morality is human flourishing, because this just kicks the can down the road to the next question is, why is human flourishing objectively good? The article in Mind notes how frequently moral realists simply assume that point rather than establish it. They say even if it were a fundamental moral fact that, say, actions are morally required if, only if, and because they maximize well-being, such realists have had little to say about why that principle holds. So what's their answer? To oversimplify a little bit, they're trying to ground normativity in essentialism. Let me define those terms. I'll try to break this down with an example to make it really clear. Academic philosophy can get really abstract, so we'll try to just, I would try not to oversimplify too much, but also break it down for the sake of a YouTube video. Normativity just has to do with human judgments that some outcomes and some actions are good and others are bad, and that would include the moral realm. Okay. Essentialism is the idea that an object has a kind of core identity or an essence that makes it what it is. So you can identify a set of attributes that are necessary for that object. I think essentialism is really fascinating. I'll come back to that. So the big picture of the article is basically saying there are these essence facts. Okay, facts that explicitly register something about the essence of a given entity, and those are the non-normative ground for normative facts. Here, let me break it down with an example. So they pose the question of why is 3 a number? And they say 3 is a number because that's just what it is to be 3. It belongs to the essence of 3 that it is a number. While such an explanation may not be as deep as various other explanations in certain respects, it is robust enough to provide illumination. It is also sometimes a fitting end to the explanatory enterprise. There may be nothing more to say to illuminate the fact that 3 is a number than that's just what 3 is. In this and many other cases of essence explanation, it may be perfectly legitimate to leave the explanans, an essence fact, unexplained, thereby treating it as an unexplained explainer. Okay, an explanans is just a term in philosophy for the explanation of something else. You have the explanandum, the thing to be explained, and the explanans, the explanation of it. Those are Latin terms. You hear them pronounced differently. What strikes me about this explanation is how brute it is as a way of addressing the problem. It seems to boil down close to saying that's just the way it is, except you're using essences as a way to say that's just the way it is. Essence facts become, in their terms, the unexplained explainers. So it's only slightly less brute than saying that's just the way it is, because you're saying that's just what its essence is. So what makes some action that contributes to human flourishing objectively good? Why was the Holocaust bad? Because it's of their essence in a way that it's just like the essence of the number 3 to be a number. Now, this seems very thin as an explanation because you just immediately ask, well, what makes the essences that way? Can we really go no further than that? It's almost like...
Okay, so back to the notes, please. Okay, so first, the explanation for the Holocaust's being wrong is going to cite the immense suffering and their explanation as well. Russ Shaver Landau has a lecture online where it's like, I forget what it's called. It's in my moral arguments playlist, but it's like goodness without God or something like that, where he gives explanations for various moral facts. And it's things like the Holocaust being wrong. And he doesn't just cite the essences. This is resting on a slight sort of misunderstanding. So first, the explanation that the Holocaust's being wrong is going to cite the immense suffering experienced by the innocent and non-consenting victims, the gross and unjustified power imbalances involved in the subjugation of the victims, the restriction of the victims' freedom and self-determination, the violation of their basic human rights that they have in virtue of the kind of beings that they are, namely rational, volitional, conscious persons, and so on. These all help to explain why the Holocaust is wrong or bad. So then we have various normative truths to the effect of the Holocaust is wrong, at least in part, because of the immense suffering it non-consensually imposes on innocent persons. The Holocaust is wrong, at least in partly in virtue of blah, 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 etc. So these are all various normative truths. Now, what Bengtson, Cuneo, and Schaefer-Landau, that's BCS, I'm going to call them BCS going forward, saves many syllables. What BCS seek to provide is an even further explanation of why this normatively fundamental principle itself holds. Right, so the normatively fundamental principle here is something to the effect of, hey, an act is wrong if, only if, and at least partly because it causes immense suffering non-consensually on innocent persons without compensating benefit or something like that. That's going to be something like a normatively fundamental principle. And what is a normatively fundamental principle? Well, it's something like, so anyway, stepping back, hold on. Stepping back, our explanation for the wrongness of the Holocaust is going to cite that normatively fundamental principle together with facts about the Holocaust, namely that the Holocaust did indeed impose immense suffering. It did indeed do it in such a way that the victims of it were non-consenting, they were innocent, they weren't compensating benefits, etc. So we cite those facts together with the normatively fundamental principle to explain the wrongness of the Holocaust. Okay, now, what BCS then seek to provide is an even further explanation of why that normatively fundamental principle itself holds, and why other normatively fundamental principles hold, if there are such other normatively fundamental principles, if this isn't the only one. And what is a normatively fundamental principle? Well, it's basically just a moral or normative fact that is not explained by any deeper normative or moral fact. It may have a deeper explanation. After all, BCS they're trying to provide a deeper explanation. So it's not absolutely fundamental. The point is just that it's normatively fundamental. It doesn't have a deeper explanation in terms of a normative fact or in terms of a moral fact. So it is this normatively fundamental principle which, according to BCS, is explained by the essences of the property of wrongness and the property of being an imposition of immense non-consensual suffering on innocence without compensating benefit. Once you understand what wrongness is, what immense suffering is, and what it is to impose that kind of suffering on these sorts of people, you will thereby see why it is normative. You will thereby see why that normatively fundamental principle is true, or at least so BCS argue. Understanding what these properties are removes mystery and provides illumination as to why these basic or normatively fundamental principles hold. So no, when asked to explain why the Holocaust is wrong, BCS aren't going to answer in the way that Gavin suggests, and answer simply to the effect of, quote, because it's of their essence in a way it's just like the essence of the number 3 to be a number. No. Instead, they'll appeal to the various features of the Holocaust, together with a normatively fundamental principle to explain the Holocaust's wrongness, and then to explain that normatively fundamental principle, they'll appeal to the essences of the features that kind of constitute the principle, namely the features of like wrongness and suffering and so on. So it's like part of the very nature of suffering, part of the very nature of wrongness, etc. Okay. Oh, yeah, and importantly, their explanation does not boil down, as Gavin seemed to be arguing, their explanation here does not boil down to saying, well, that's just the way it is. As BCS argue in their article, they don't provide a kind of vacuous, unilluminating account which merely adverts to the very fact in need of explanation, as happens in the case of you saying to your kids, that's just the way that the world is. Instead, their explanation cites a categorically different kind of fact altogether, namely non-normative facts about essences to explain normatively fundamental facts. And to me, at least, I can only speak for myself here, it seems like a reasonable explanation. It seems to me that once you grasp what the normative property of badness is, there's no mystery as to why, and once you grasp what suffering is, there's no mystery as to why intense suffering is bad. I mean, to me, this is just characteristic of a good explanation. Once one grasps the explanans, so what it is to be suffering and what the property of badness itself is, there's no mystery as to why the explanandum obtains. If someone, upon fully understanding wrongness, immense suffering, etc., didn't then assent to that proposition that excruciating suffering is bad, that would provoke bafflement in me. I'd be like, you sure, bro? Are you sure? Like, I don't know. That would kind of make me kind of a little bit baffled. And the same is true for BCS, as they say, and the same is true for many others. Some other points here. Gavin also appeared to raise another worry about this account. I'm not sure if I'm jumping the gun, because maybe he says it in the next sort of points, but I'll just say this here. He appeared to raise the worry that, well, this account just lands in brute, unexplained facts about essences, and isn't that objectionable? Well, so for starters, it's not clear why that's so bad. I mean, is there any explanation for why it's the case that what it is to be water is to be H2O? I mean, like, why is that the essence of water? I don't know. I'm left in an explanatory loss here. There doesn't seem to be an explanation of this essence fact, but that doesn't mean that it's not an essence fact, and nor does it mean that this essence fact fails to explain certain other features of water. And it seems to me that the same could easily be the case for BCS's account. But more importantly, I don't see how theism is in any better position here. Like, theism too lands in brute, unexplained facts in its account of morality. Right? Again, like, God is good. Why? Right? What explains God's goodness? In virtue of what is God good? As noted at the beginning of the video, I see only 3 plausible answers here. You could say that the explanation is that God is loving, kind, and just, and that these attributes make God good. But then the non-theist can make the same move, right? What makes certain acts and states of affairs good? Well, their lovingness and kindness and justice and so on. Both accounts end in the same sort of explanation, and so theism seems to enjoy no explanatory advantage here. You could say that God is good by nature, right? Like, what it is to be God is to be good. That's a second option you could go in responding to my question. But then you've cited an essence fact, a non-normative essence fact, as the ultimate explanatory stopping point for morality, which is precisely the same thing that BCS do, right? So once again, theism seems, at least to me, to enjoy no explanatory advantage here. Thirdly, and finally, it seems to me that the theist might say that, or the moral arguer rather, might say that there is no explanation for God's goodness. It's just a fundamental feature of reality. But then you're saddled with primitive, unexplained normativity or unexplained morality. And so you have no ultimate ground for morality. Your explanatory stopping point in explaining other moral facts would itself be a moral fact, namely that God is good. And so you don't even, they haven't even given a grounding for morality as such if they make this move, if they, as in the moral arguers. By contrast, BCS cite non-normative, non-moral facts to ground the normatively fundamental principles. And hence they do supply a grounding for morality. Oh, and also, if the moral arguer is going to take this route, well then it's hardly an objection to the BCS account that essence facts are themselves primitive if the moral arguer's own account of morality likewise ends in primitivity. So, or bruteness. So this third option would remove the force of Gavin's objection in any case. So that's my collection of responses to Gavin's point about how brute the account is and whatnot. So yeah.
All right, Joe, I'm going to speed up the video to 1.5. And
I'm so sorry. Yeah, I mean, we can go for an hour and a half. I can go till I can go for an hour and a half. That's fine.
Okay, we'll see. I don't want to push it. And
okay.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people commenting. I have my own thoughts, but I think let's just get your presentation done first.
Okay. So yeah, back to Gavin's video.
It's like you have the explanandum and it goes this far, and then the explanans goes just to the same extent and no further than the very thing that you're trying to explain. It kind of reminds me of when my kids ask me a question about nature and I don't know the answer, so I'll just say, I'm not sure, that's just the way the world is. I haven't really given them much information in saying that, right? Not only that, not only is this account explanatorily brute, but it seems to raise a new question of how do you have essences? Because now you got to explain that. And I'll never forget reading through this philosophy book on metaphysics by Edward Lau. He was a professor of philosophy at Durham. I like his writing because he's very clear, and just being struck by how even traditional metaphysical categories seem to be more slippery and more arbitrary in non-theism. How do you retain essences in a reductively physicalist or naturalistic worldview? That is a tricky question. He goes on for a long time about it. That's something I'd like to address in another context sometime, talking about basically angels and how angels affect the question of essentialism. But that's another thing. The point for now is I'm kind of underwhelmed by this article, even though it's a very smart.
Okay, so we can go back to the notes. The question here is like, how do you have essences under naturalism? Like, how do you have essences in a reductively physicalist or naturalistic worldview? So I think there are a couple points to make here. First, BCS are not reductive physicalists, and neither am I. And their account of morality is non-naturalist in character. They don't take essence facts or even normative facts to be reducible to physical, scientifically investigable facts. So even if there's a tension here, it doesn't actually address the non-theistic account in question. And secondly, it's not actually clear to me why there's a tension between naturalism and essences. I mean, like water is essentially H2O. Water couldn't have been anything other than H2O. Heat is essentially mean molecular kinetic energy. Lightning is essentially electric discharge. As far as I can see, these claims pose no challenge to naturalism. Natural things can have essences and essential properties. Essences don't need to be taken to be like spooky, ghostly, metaphysical entities. An essence is simply what it is to be a certain thing. What it is to be water is to be H2O. That's the essence of water, and that requires nothing supernatural as far as I can see. So that's my response to that point.
You want to move back to the video?
Yeah.
Smart people, it's technically well executed. Nonetheless, the explanation seems pretty brute. Okay, so now I'm starting to go through other articles. You know how it is. You read one thing, you pull on one string, and a bunch of other things start coming out. I'm finding the same thing in a bunch of other articles. Here's another article by a commonly cited figure working in this area in the journal Religious Studies, which is another reputable journal. And this article is basically opposing William Lane Craig's moral argument. He's going on and on, poking holes or trying to in Craig's argument. And I'm wondering, okay, what's your explanation? Finally, toward the end, it comes up. He says, why are love and justice and generosity and kindness and faithfulness good? What is there in the depths of reality to make them good? My own preferred answer is nothing further. If you like, you may say that they are the ultimate standard of goodness. What makes them the standard? Nothing further. Possessing these characteristics just is good making, full stop. And then he's basically going on to say, well, that's no more arbitrary than theism. So I go to my third article. This is written by one of the leading philosophers on this question who's written numerous books and articles on it. And he comes to the same basic point. He's basically saying some moral facts are simply brute facts. But then again, the existence of God is a brute fact, so that doesn't fare any better either. Quote, of the ethical states of affairs that obtain necessarily, at least some of them are brute facts. I call such facts basic ethical facts. Such facts are the foundation of the rest of objective morality and rest on no foundation themselves. To ask of such facts, where do they come from, or on what foundation do they rest, is misguided in much the way that, according to many theists, it is misguided to ask of God, where does he come from, or on what foundation does he rest? The answer is the same in both cases. They come from nowhere, and nothing external to themselves grounds their existence. Now, elsewhere, I might try to have more time to address why I think God is a better candidate for the kind of primal reality that explains all other reality, the kind of stopping point for explanation. This is what you get into in the literature on this topic, and it gets really abstract, so I'm not going to go down the rabbit trail here. But basically, God is uncaused and infinite. Moral facts are not infinite, and it's very far from clear that they're uncaused either. God is also a singular entity, whereas moral truths are multiple. So it seems much more parsimonious to give God this role of the sort of unexplained explainer with respect to the moral realm. However, I can talk about that more sometime, even if someone disputes that. The point for now is just to observe that, again, this response is explanatorily brute. That just means as a way, in other words, colloquially, it's a way of saying it's just the way it is. It's like when I tell my kids, I don't know, that's just the way the world is, you know? In his words, basic ethical facts, quote, come from nowhere and nothing external to themselves grounds their existence, end quote. Okay. I won't go through other articles. I might draw up my research on this into an article myself sometime if I can find the time.
Okay, back to my notes. So I'll take this in reverse order. I mean, the second point, so his second objection to Wielenberg's account is that, his view lands in a kind of, it's explanatorily brute. As Gavin says, for Wielenberg, basic ethical facts come from nowhere and nothing external to them grounds their existence. But again, it seems to me that theism's account of morality also is explanatorily brute in the same sort of way, right? God's goodness comes from nowhere. There's nothing that gives rise to God's goodness. I mean, unless you say, it's God's love and so on. But then again, the non-theist can make the exact same move. It's like the love of creatures and the virtue of creatures and whatnot that explains their goodness. So, and again, nothing external to God grounds God's goodness. So if it's a problem for an account of morality that it ends in explanatory bruteness, well, then Gavin's theistic account is also problematic on this front. And if it's not a problem, well, then his objection to Wielenberg's account on the basis of bruteness doesn't hold water. And then I guess the other point that I want to make is that Gavin says it's much more parsimonious to give God the role as the unexplained explainer rather than Wielenberg's fundamental moral truths or principles, since God is singular, whereas such truths are plural. But I think there are at least two problems with this. First, in terms of the number of things posited, Gavin is also positing Wielenberg's moral truths. He's simply not taking them to be fundamental entities, but instead grounded in God in some way. So it seems like Gavin is ontologically committed to every entity that Wielenberg is, and then more, since Gavin also adds God to the picture. So it seems to me that Wielenberg's view is at least ontologically more parsimonious, which is one dimension of parsimony that at least many philosophers think matters. Another point to make here is that Gavin also seems to have a significant cost in terms of qualitative complexity, or complexity in the kinds of things posited by hypothesis, since Gavin posits a radically different kind of concrete thing in his ontology in his exploration of morality, namely a non-spatiotemporal, necessary, unlimited, infinite God. This is a kind of thing that non-theists don't posit, that a non-theistic account of morality doesn't posit. And so this is yet another important complexity cost of his explanation that he doesn't mention and that non-theists do without. So that's one point that I want to make in response to Gavin's point about parsimony. And then the second point is that Wielenberg doesn't actually need to commit to multiple fundamental moral truths. We can develop his account in a way such that there's only one fundamental moral principle, thus reducing his fundamental posits to a single case. What might that principle be? Well, for instance, for the utilitarian, it'll be that the moral properties of acts, states of affairs, etc., are determined by their maximization of the welfare of sentient beings. That's a popular fundamental singular principle, which many take to explain all other moral truths. But one could employ a different fundamental moral principle if one wants. One could give a kind of natural law theory-based fundamental moral principle, or a Kantian-based one, or lots of other ones. So those are my responses to his objections to Wielenberg's account. I don't ultimately think they succeed.
Well, suffice to say, these three representative examples are leading articles in this field. They're not misrepresentative. Some of the other ones will even say things like, basically, you have to have moral truths must be brute. One of the articles I read starts off saying, anyone who believes in moral truths at all must believe that they are brute. There are brute and inexplicable ones. Later, he compares this claim to the idea that explanation has to stop at some point. Now, my response to this is like this. So here's my experience. So the third section as I finish up and respond to this. I'm being told on the one hand, oh, you don't need God to have objective moral values and duties. There's all kinds of other possibilities. All kinds of people are moral realists without God. But then I go to these other possibilities and I'm finding them pretty thin. They're just saying it's kind of a brute fact. And the question that rises for me is, why are we so content with bruteness? And
I mean, listen, he said he's going to these other possibilities. With all due respect, I appreciate all the work that Gavin has put into this video, but he has gone through maybe 2 accounts here. I mean, again, there are dozens. So I don't think objecting to these 2 accounts suffices to make the case for the moral arguer. And again, I've also argued that his objections to these 2 accounts don't even succeed. So I think the critic of the moral argument is in a good position here. At least that's my assessment.
Inexplicability. My dictionary defines brute as characterized by an absence of reasoning or intelligence, and inexplicable as unable to be explained or accounted for. Why do we make peace with bruteness and inexplicability, there's a word, so easily? This seems like just a hard lunge into mystery. Maybe what some people are thinking is, well, bruteness and morality is okay because we just don't need an explanation. Everybody knows that some things are just wrong, and you don't need to try to explain that to people. But I want to finish by giving 2 reasons why I think that is naive. And I think we should be uneasy with bruteness as an explanation for moral realism apart from God. Number one is, this kind of easy assumption of moral realism apart from God is at variance with much of historic atheism. Today, many of the new atheists like Sam Harris, many other atheists will speak more confidently about moral realism. You get these claims, like the Quentin Smith quote I started with. In Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape, I've quoted this, that's an amazing book. He's just taking it for granted that things like philanthropy and individual human rights and compassion, these are good things. He thinks you can establish these things by reason alone. Now, I've addressed that in my book, but what I want to point out is just that way of thinking is relatively novel in the historical development of atheism. In older iterations of atheism in the 19th century and the 20th century, it was much more common to see atheism as unleashing a kind of moral chaos and devastation. You see this in the Existentialists, for example. Jean-Paul Sartre, in his famous essay on existentialism, rejected the efforts of earlier French atheists to retain objective morality apart from God, calling it extremely embarrassing that God does not exist, for there disappears with him all possibility of finding values in an intelligible heaven. He doesn't really argue for that. He just kind of takes it for granted. Later on, he compares morality and art. He says morality and art are both matters of invention and creation. And for people who find that self-constructed values, like artistic morality, is not a real morality, his response is blunt and yet honest. I am very sorry that it should be so, but if I have excluded God the Father, there must be somebody to invent values. Now, in my book, I discuss the articulation of a similar position by Dostoevsky's character, Ivan Karamazov, in the book, The Brothers Karamazov. If you want a dramatic, vivid, I would say, honestly, it's worth the time. I know we don't read these long novels anymore. We just watch YouTube videos. That book will change your life. It is worth reading. It is profound. It will make the moral dilemma vivid to you and poignant to you like nothing else can. It's an amazing piece of literature. In that book, Ivan Karamazov has this famous, dreadful statement, if God does not exist, all things are possible. This is a statement often cited in the context of these discussions. That statement was cited approvingly by Sartre, as well as by the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, whose conception of the death of God, I also discuss in my book as another example of a moral anti-realism, similar to Sartre's, but with a different kind of twist or flavor. It has a more kind of despairing undercurrent to it. Nietzsche was a kind of moral nihilist. He basically said there are no moral facts, and moral judgments are absurd. You can pause the video and read this very juicy quote if you want. It's pretty amazing. But there's lots of people like this. Sartre and Nietzsche are 2 kind of major figureheads. But you can find this all. Bertrand Russell's another one. So especially as you go back older. So what I'm finding is there's this discrepancy between this kind of tendency toward moral despair in atheism in the 19th and 20th century, especially in Europe, whereas today there's more of a sense of buoyancy and even self-righteousness at times in the attitude on these questions. If you want to trace out this really interesting question of early modernity versus late modernity on these kinds of questions, the Cambridge Companion on Existentialism, that occupies that book as a theme. It's really interesting. Even just in the introduction, it kind of takes up that question. But the point for now is just to say this. You can say that the older atheists like Sartre and Nietzsche were wrong, but you can't say that we all just know that some things are evil. You can't have a kind of complacent appeal to bruteness, because we don't all know that. Atheism as a tradition of thought doesn't bear that claim out. Many of its most eloquent proponents didn't think that claim was obvious. We don't all just know that some things are wrong. For many leading...
So you can go back to my notes. I think there are a few things to say here. So, I mean, first, I haven't seen anyone attempt a rigorous survey of historical and contemporary philosophically informed non-theists, even going back to like pre-Socratic times, to determine what proportion think God is required for morality. At best, I think we get like a few examples of a few prominent continental atheist philosophers, plus some more recent like error theorists, and maybe a few other people dabbled in from the 20th century. And that's not, to me, a very impressive sample, and it was one that was clearly selected non-randomly. It's also like well known that most of these continental atheist existentialists were not very rigorous and often failed to present arguments for their views. Clearly, then, I say the sample is not representative of the best available work by non-theists on these questions. Second, I mean, I do think it's valuable to ask why at least some prominent atheists disagree with me about whether God is required for morality. I don't really think that this indicates, at least strongly, that I'm wrong. I mean, it might be some slight Bayesian evidence, but, almost anything is slight Bayesian evidence. But there are lots of, I guess the point that I want to make here is that there are also tons of prominent atheists who agree with me, and I have evaluated the arguments put forward by those who disagree with me, and I found them wanting. Now, I haven't actually found any argument in Nietzsche or Sartre, and those of Mackey and Rosenberg are interesting, admittedly, but unsuccessful in my view, and most professional meta-ethicists also think that they're unsuccessful. And as a result, I shouldn't feel compelled to significantly decrease my confidence in the conclusion that God isn't required for morality. At least that's my assessment of this point about prominent atheists who disagree with me. And I can also, rattle off lots of professional theistic philosophers who don't think God is needed for morality. And also a very relevant piece of data is that at least the majority of professional meta-ethicists agree with me that God isn't required for morality. Proportionally few professional meta-ethicists think God is required for morality. So if we're evidentially taking into account relevant experts' views on these questions, this is a notable fact. And I mean, I say this with actually like a decent deal of knowledge of the discipline, just like reading papers and going to many different conferences and talking with all sorts of different philosophers and what's taken seriously. But also, I mean, it's on the basis of empirical evidence from, for instance, the Phil paper survey. I don't need to get into that here because we don't have time, but let's skip forward to his points about animal morality. We're not skipping forward much. Oh, and in his video. Yeah, there we go.
Thinkers in the atheist tradition, that was very far from obvious. The second reason I think that we should worry about a kind of easy assumption that Bruteness is fine as an explanation for moral realism is our evolutionary history and our relationship to the animal kingdom, just for the sake of this argument, assuming evolution for the moment as a valid scientific theory, which I broadly accept. But just saying you don't have to accept that to see my point here. The arbitrariness of moral realism without God can be seen in how it treats human morality as qualitatively different from animal morality without a clear justification. So here's an example to get us into this. There are violent wars among different communities of chimpanzees. This is kind of amazing. People didn't believe this when it first came out, but you can read about these online. Basically, like in Tanzania in the 70s, there was like this 4-year war among these communities of chimpanzees. Okay, it's very violent. And obviously, it disrupts chimpanzee well-being. Right? Okay, but we don't regard the instigators of these wars as morally blameworthy and punishable in the way we think of Stalin and Hitler and people like this who provoke human wars and human violence. We don't put the violent chimpanzees in jail or give them the electric chair or something like this. We recognize there's something qualitatively unique about human beings with respect to morality. Now, in theism, you have various possibilities for explaining that. The big idea is not just creation in God's image, but there's lots of things that from a theistic worldview, for most theistic worldviews, there is some basis for a qualitative difference between human beings and animals. You see this all throughout history in the Declaration of Independence, the statement that the verb endowed. They're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. So there's an endowing process that comes from the creator to human beings that doesn't go to the animal kingdom and that explains this qualitative difference. In the Bible, Genesis 3, you've got the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Okay, so this is, trying to explain this difference, qualitative difference between human beings and animals with respect to our moral knowledge. You also have the idea of future divine judgment, which interacts with our intuitive feeling about the significance of morality, that whether you spend your life like Hitler or Mother Teresa matters in some transcendent way. We have that intuition. And theism has various ways to account for that and explain that, and even validate that. And the idea of judgment or recompense after this life is over is one way of doing that. I'm not trying to say that's all correct right now. I'm just saying that's a way to explain that. In atheism, it's very difficult to explain why there should be any qualitative difference between human morality and animal morality in the way we intuit that. The behavior from chimpanzees in these wars that I just described is basically how the entire animal kingdom works. The strong devour the weak. We never think of animals mistreating each other as like sinning or something like this, or in the way that we think of that with human behavior. So the question is, why does morality suddenly start to change once you get to human beings? How do you account for that on atheism? Now, someone might say, well, we just know. It's just a brute fact.
Pause.
We just know that certain things are wrong with respect.
And back to the notes. Okay, so I think there are pretty compelling non-theistic explanations for why human morality is different from the social behavior of animals. The question, the precise question here is like, well, why do we appropriately blame, praise, hold accountable, punish, etc. humans for their behavior, but not, say, chimpanzees and dolphins and the little tiny mole rat or whatever? Okay, so the explanation is that, at least in my view, the explanation is that humans have various morally relevant intrinsic features that non-human animals lack. In particular, humans have the capacity to understand, deliberate on, and act on the basis of reasons. Animals aren't sensitive to the range of reasons bearing on their actions. And this explains, together with their inability to modulate their behavior in light of that sensitivity, this explains why they aren't morally culpable for their actions. They can't be held accountable since they can't be privy to the range of specifically moral reasons counting for or against their actions. And they also can't modulate their behavior in light of that sensitivity to reasons. But, of course, humans are different. We have various intrinsic rational capacities, like capacities to apprehend and base our actions on reasons. This means that we're liable to praise and blame if we act for bad reasons or overlook good reasons. None of this cites God. It's a perfectly kosher explanation of the difference between human morality on the one hand and animal behavior, on the other hand, in terms of our inherent capacities as the kind of beings that we are. Gavin's objection also alleges that the non-theist's inability to explain the difference between human morality and animal behavior makes non-theistic morality arbitrary. But on the contrary, it seems to me that it's at least arguable that Gavin's theistic view might threaten arbitrariness. I mean, like God, Gavin was talking about endowing, so God's somehow endowing us with rights or something like that, or dignity or value or worth or whatever. But I mean, God either has some reason for endowing us with a relevant form of dignity or worth or value that specially sets us apart from non-human animals, or he doesn't. If he doesn't, then our having that dignity is just arbitrary, since God has no reason at all for endowing it upon us. But if he does have such a reason, say because of the intrinsic features of humans, like the previously mentioned rational capacities, or our intellect, or our will, or something like that, various intrinsic features of us, well, then it's quite plausibly that very reason which accounts for our having dignity or worth or value. And God is simply serving as an intermediary here. Even under atheism, we'd have those same intrinsic capacities like rationality and intellect and will and so on, and consciousness and relationality with others and so on. And it seems like those features alone, or at least this is how it seems to me, it seems like those features alone are sufficient to account for why we have a special kind of dignity or worth or value. So, and in that case, the charge that atheism cannot account for dignity / worth / value vanishes. So then it seems to me that either theism suffers from arbitrariness, or else the non-theist has an account of the phenomenon, contrary to Gavin's objection. So yeah. And we could just play out the rest of Gavin's video, and then I'll end out with my stuff.
All right, sure. Yeah, we don't have much left.
Respect to the moral, with respect to human behavior, but here's where this gets really tricky, and I'll kind of finish off the video by talking about evolutionary psychology a little bit. Our knowledge, our perception of this as just a brute fact is itself a product of the evolutionary process. It's the accidental byproduct of survival of the fittest and random genetic mutation, this winnowing effect of hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary struggle that have produced our conscience as we know it. And there's nothing in atheism outside of that process directing it, because you can believe in God and evolution, but in atheism, evolution is the reductive explanation of everything about us. So those who are advocating for moral realism without God often will admit that our morality is accidental. It could have been different. So Wielenberg, for example, says that our moral properties are important, but it could have been other. He says, quote, if, as I believe, there is no God, then it is in some sense an accident that we have the moral properties that we do. Okay. So in other words, if the evolutionary process had gone differently, we would have completely different moral intuitions. We might regard infanticide as not only morally acceptable, but morally obligatory in certain conditions, as happens a lot throughout the animal kingdom. Sexual cannibalism, which is common among praying mantises, octopuses, various kinds of spiders and scorpions. We obviously, we see it as a brute fact if that's wrong. If you rewound the evolutionary tape, things played out differently. It could be a brute fact that is a noble and dutiful act. Darwin himself talked about this. We call these Darwinian counterfactuals. I talk a lot about them in my book. He gives this example. If men were reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. The point is this. In an atheistic worldview, what we regard as an obvious brute fact, needing no explanation, could easily be very different. So to sum up, I would say the idea of objective moral values and duties as just brute facts is a very precarious concept. It's not well supported by the history of atheism or our evolutionary history in the non-human animal world behind us. We might perceive some things as obvious, morally obvious today, but only because of highly contingent circumstances in our evolutionary history. And many historic atheists have recognized that that's not an obvious perception. At the end of the day, moral realism is extremely mysterious on atheism. It's not something, in my opinion, you can just affirm with a shrug of, oh yeah, that's no problem at all. It's a difficult question. And if atheism leaves you with just brute explanations, why not consider theism as an alternative? That's my closing question. Now, to fully vet that alternative, we got to keep talking. So let me know what you think in the comments. This video is on topics that I normally haven't done as much on, though I plan to do more in the future. And I actually have in the past when I first started on YouTube 3 years ago in 2020. I love philosophy. I'm going to be doing philosophy stuff now and again. I won't stop doing the other things I'm doing, but every now and again I'll have a philosophy video. So if you know of someone who might find this useful, the algorithms probably won't naturally take it everywhere it may need to go. So if you could help me share this, pass it along, talk about it, that kind of stuff, that always really helps. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'll try to remember to put everything in the video description if you want to follow up on things. And I'm sure we'll talk about this again sometime here on my channel.
Okay, we can. Okay, so apologies because I was typing there. That probably got caught in my mic. So that's I did not know that. This is what happens when I have my usual mic here, which I'm operating on. It doesn't catch the typing, but I understand now that it caught my typing. So that's okay. But we all make mistakes, don't we? Okay. So point number. So the first thing that I want to say here is that we have, in this last part of the video, we're kind of different. We're in a different domain than the question of like grounding morality, explaining morality and moral facts. That's the kind of ontology side. That's the metaphysics side of things. We've instead shifted realms to the realm of epistemology here, and whether or not a naturalistic account can adequately explain our having moral knowledge. So I just want to note that we are in a separate argument. This is a separate argument. We're in the realm of epistemology, not ontology. And yeah, okay. So one thing that I want to say is that Gavin, I think this is close to a direct quote. He said something like evolution is the reductive explanation of everything about us, with the implicit rider that that's under naturalism. Now, I think he may have misspoke there. That's certainly not true as stated. I mean, there are lots of like non-evolutionary factors that explain various features of us, such as culture.
Joe, can I jump in?
Yeah.
I think he said atheism is reductive, if I'm not mistaken.
That would be even worse if that's what he said.
Okay.
So I forget.
Maybe I'm mistaken. I don't.
I totally forget. I don't remember. So if he said atheism, that would be very bad because, like, I mean, listen, you could be like a Neoplatonic mystical atheist, as like Eric Steinhardt is, So it's like you don't you can believe in like the one, which is this absolutely simple, impersonal, ultimate reality that we can attain mystical union with, and that we've we emanate from the one and we return to the one. Like that's all compatible with atheism. Atheism is like such a bare hypothesis. It's certainly not the case under atheism that evolution is a reductive explanation of everything about us. But even under naturalism, that's not the case. There are other factors like culture and many other things, non-evolutionary factors that shape us and what, our psychology, etc. Okay, so that's a minor point. The major point is that we are now into the realm of evolution, what are called evolutionary debunking arguments, which are arguments that are meant to show that, hey, at least if naturalism is true, then we don't have any moral knowledge, which would be, since at least many of us think that we do have moral knowledge, that would be a problem for naturalism. At least for people who think that we do have such knowledge. So this, I think, is the best argument in Gavin's video. And I don't myself have a settled view about how to solve the difficulty here. So yeah, the guiding idea behind evolutionary debunking arguments is that we lack moral knowledge because our moral intuitions and our evaluative dispositions, so our dispositions to evaluate things in certain ways, and those were selected for their adaptiveness rather than for their kind of truth trackingness, at least not directly, which arguably people have argued provides a defeater for our beliefs based on those intuitions and those evaluative dispositions. And a defeater, by the way, for a given belief is just some true proposition that when added to your beliefs would kind of remove your justification for it. So the idea here is that we don't have moral knowledge because we face a defeater for our moral beliefs if naturalism is true. And there are different ways you could spell out what the relevant defeater might be, but we don't need to go into those. And so what's my take here? Well, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of papers and books on this topic. And as a result of this work, a number of proposed solutions to the evolutionary challenge have emerged that, 1, don't require God, 2, if successful, account for our having moral knowledge, and 3, don't just render that knowledge a mere matter of luck. Now, whether these proposed solutions succeed is controversial. I'm the first to admit that. And exploring that controversy is, I think, beyond the purview of our discussion here. But to at least just take 4 examples of publications that people can check out on this matter that immediately came to mind when I took these notes. Check out the work of William Fitzpatrick more generally. He's a really good philosopher who, argues that this sort of Darwinian challenge doesn't succeed. I put one of his pieces here, but you can find all of his pieces on his website, I think. The piece that I put here is Why There Is No Darwinian Dilemma for Ethical Realism. It's in an edited volume by my old professors, Michael Bergman and Pat Kane from Purdue. The volume is Challenges to Moral and Religious Belief, Disagreement and Evolution. People can also check out David Enoch's book, Taking Morality Seriously, A Defense of Robust Realism. In chapter 7, therein, he responds to this sort of challenge. He defends what's called a third factor approach to the problem, which Eric Wielenberg incidentally also defends. A third thing that people can check out is Michael Huemer's Ethical Intuitionism, chapter 8, where he addresses this sort of challenge. Elsewhere, Huemer appeals to kind of coherence reasoning about moral intuitions as a way to explain our moral knowledge. I think he defends this in his paper, Revisionary Intuitionism, but don't quote me on that. And finally, people can check out Ryan Bartle's 2023 PhD dissertation, Defending Normative Realism Against Evolutionary Debunking Arguments. That's also available for free online if you just search it up. And for more such publications, I mean, people could just search fieldpapers.org, academia.edu, Google Scholar, JSTOR, etc. And I guess I just want to end here by saying it's worth noting that some philosophers have argued that theism likewise results in normative skepticism. So in that same Bergman-Kane volume that I mentioned earlier, Sharon Street has a chapter entitled "If Everything Happens for a Reason, Then We Don't Know What Reasons Are, Why the Price of Theism is Normative Skepticism." I'm not here claiming that the argument succeeds, but like one basic idea behind these sorts of arguments, among other guiding ideas, is that if we don't know that some things are just intrinsically impermissible, such as allowing someone to be tortured, raped, and then subsequently dismembered to death, even though one has the power and means to prevent it, well then, that appears to undercut our moral knowledge more generally, since such claims seem as secure as any other moral claim. And yet, theism requires denying such a claim, since God allows precisely that sort of thing, and God cannot do anything impermissible. So, again, to be clear, I am not saying that this sort of argument succeeds. There are ways to respond to it, okay? And my sole point is that the atheist isn't the only one with normative skeptical challenges to address. Things aren't as smooth sailing, in other words, as Gavin might want us to think. And also, the final point, I tend to think that this same point about at least potentially implying normative skepticism afflicts at least popular versions of Christianity even more pungently than bare theism. So for instance, it seems plausible to many of us that whatever else perfect goodness is, something that's perfectly good wouldn't drown innocent babies in a worldwide or even local flood, or sanction the mauling of 42 young boys just because of some insults, they insulted the prophet, or collectively punish people, or as Exodus chapter 20, verse 5 says, punish the children for the sin of their parents to the third and fourth generation, or command the entire total destruction of entire people groups, specifically to include the women and children, etc. If these moral intuitions are undermined, at least some popular versions of Christian theism require, not all versions of Christian theism, but some popular versions of Christian theism require, well, then it's hard to see how we can trust our moral intuitions more generally, since these moral intuitions seem as secure as any other moral intuitions, or at least I can confess they seem that way to me. So at least many Christian theists must also face the challenge of normative skepticism. And again, my main point here is just that the atheist isn't the only one with at least a challenge here, okay? Again, there are ways to respond to these sorts of things. I don't want to overplay my hand. I'm not an expert in ethics and these sorts of skeptical challenges. I work in metaphysics, so I am a lowly metaphysician and a philosopher of religion. But like, you know, I've looked into this stuff a little bit. So that's my take on Gavin's video. I will say, I did appreciate Gavin's video. I appreciated him reaching out to me and, engaging lots of this very important scholarly work and helping people think through these matters. And I appreciate Gavin's friendship. I call him a friend. And yeah, I appreciate the video, and I appreciate everyone who's interested in promoting good scholarly content on YouTube.
Thank you, Joe. Joe, do you need to get running?
I've got like 5 minutes.
Okay, so let me just ask you some quick questions. So at the end, some people are asking when you mention all of these papers, you were mentioning them in order to get people a feel for the literature, not necessarily saying, look at this tsunami of papers and ergo theism is false or something like that. Just to clarify. Right. Yes. Yeah. I hope, I've tried to make various like riders or provisos about what I'm doing when I make these various comments, like saying, hey, this stuff is really controversial. There are objections to this. I make those riders all the time. Putting these links and whatnot is not to say like this is a solved problem or that theism is debunked or any sorts of things like that. It's more so to make people aware of all the like actually genuinely really good scholarly work on these questions that very often doesn't get brought up in popular apologetics debates, even by non-theist debaters. So I really want to just raise awareness. Okay, and then I'll ask you two more. So one is just kind of for myself. So if you could go back a few pages, it's the one where you mention like the 3 strategies that a theist could take. And one of them, the second one was the one that like I would take personally, which is that, there we go, that God is good by nature, that God is goodness itself. You know that I'm a classical theist. Gavin's a classical theist as well. So I kind of need to defend my guy. I don't want to think in tribalistic terms, but what you're saying here is that, if you want to go down that road, that's fine. but just don't say that you have an advantage over BCS because they're doing something similar. They're just not doing it theistically, right?
Yeah, right,
And
exactly.
so it's not, I mean, you're not concluding ergo theism is false. You might say theism is unnecessary, right? I mean, and that's a question to be reckoned with. But for example, I, as a classical theist, could say, you know what? That's, I mean, hypothetically, I mean, I haven't thought through this entirely. I could say that's fair. So I just won't use the moral argument, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, at most, that's, or at least that's one thing that you could conclude from this. Is that fair?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So, and in fact, I mean, if I were a theist, I would go either the second way here or the third way here. I mean, wait, no, sorry, either the first way or the second way here, not the third way. I would definitely not say that there's no explanation for God's goodness. I would either say, yeah, no, I'm just by nature, like what it is to be God is to be good. And you can construe that in identity, or you could just say, his nature is good, or like something like that. That's the second way to go. And notice that I don't actually object to that view here. In this second point, my point is simply that Gavin's the one who's trying to mount a moral argument. He's trying to convince us that either we need God to explain morality, or that God is the best explanation of morality, and that these other accounts, like the BCS account, are no good. And I'm just trying to kind of poke holes in his case for making that claim, for that positive claim. And so then here, I'm not really challenging the view that God is good by nature. I'm just saying, well, if you go that route, well, then it seems like Gavin's argument is undercut, because it's the same sort of thing that the BCS are arguing. They're appealing to essentialist facts, just as this sort of essentialist fact is doing here. So yeah, that's the purpose of that point. I mean, now earlier on, I gave some preliminary, like, potential reasons for thinking that we might not want to identify God with goodness. But again, like I said, it's controversial whether or not those things succeed.
Yeah, and if I went with the second strategy using classical metaphysics, then would the question shift to then problems, so to speak, with classical metaphysics? Is that kind of where you would go next? Or okay.
No, potentially. I mean, like, listen, as far as I'm concerned in this discussion, you can have all the classical metaphysics and whatnot you want. I am just saying that you haven't, quote unquote, you. I'm just saying that the moral arguer has not given me a sufficiently good reason to think that we need God to explain morality. You guys may very well have a perfectly coherent, perfectly workable view in and of yourself, but like don't go around then saying that like others cannot have also perfectly coherent, workable views that could also provide just as good explanations of morality. That's what I'm challenging. I wouldn't even necessarily go on to challenge the classical metaphysics. I mean, I ultimately probably disagree with numbers aspects of it, but in terms of the dialectical context of our video here, I would only point out that I haven't been given a sufficiently good reason to think that we need all that to account for morality. Sure. I wouldn't necessarily directly go for the jugular and attack it.
Right, because I mean, the way that I've constructed my own moral argument, but it's very different, because basically, like, if you look at like Craig's argument, I would actually agree that if there is no God, there is no objective morality, in the sense that I believe that if there isn't a God, nothing would nothing other than God would exist. But that doesn't seem to be how he's interpreting that, right? Or how he's trying to take it, perhaps, or I don't know. Maybe it's like per impossible, right? Consider that there is no God, then there is this outcome that follows logically. So, I don't know. I wouldn't take it that far.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, like, yeah, some of these like kind of factuals or kind of possibles are hard to envisage. I mean, I think in evaluating these questions, we sort of have to compare the relevant kind of like worldviews. So we wouldn't be able to sort of just like take for granted that if there were no God, that there wouldn't even be any non-God things as well. We just basically have to say, like, listen, I mean, like, you're positing this worldview which doesn't have God in it, but it does have these other things in it. Are you still even able, within the terms of that worldview, to have objective morality? And Craig is going to say no. And I think if we're in that sort of route, my answer would be, well, of course, for the various reasons that I've canvassed. But yeah.
Okay.
And so I think you would also, even if like you yourself think that even if God didn't exist, then strictly speaking, nothing would exist. You could still say that, well, in terms of this worldview comparison, where we're bracketing my commitment there, and I'm examining the naturalistic worldview, or just certain non-naturalistic but atheistic worldviews, you could still grant that, sure, yeah, under those sorts of worldviews, you would still actually be able to have morality. I have various other commitments that lead me to reject those worldviews, but
sure.
But yeah, anyway.
Yeah, and then two things. One is that going back to something you said about evolution being reductive, or like you were kind of quoting Ortland. I look back at the transcript and it's really funny. He says under atheism, evolution is reductive. So it was both actually, but you caught the more relevant portion, or maybe I got a really relevant qualifier. So I think putting those two together, that's kind of an interesting combination just to describe what his view is. So just to flag that in case, just to make sure that we're quoting him fairly, but I think you would still object nonetheless.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. And then the last question, I promise, from the audience. I'm so sorry. So many people asked like really good questions, but I can only get to one. So Deus Primum asked, like, another problem for Joe is that his account of morality is only going to probably be accepted by few or some, going back to kind of the survey that you did of what meta-ethicists think and so on and so forth. Most people are not going to accept his particular view of morality based on reason alone. So just can you interact with this really quick?
Yeah, so I mean, I really do appreciate this comment, and well, we'll see. I mean, when I take over the world, and people are going to accept, a lot of people are going to accept no, but like, listen, I appreciate this, and I mean, I think we need to have a lot of intellectual humility when we're just trying to use reason alone. I mean, we are. I mean, we're very stupid creatures. So, I mean, I'm sorry, but I mean, like, we need to have requisite epistemic humility. I can just go off what seems most plausible to me and what I think reason reveals. And so just based on what I think is most plausible, I come to these conclusions, and I can try to help others see the plausibility, as I've tried to help in this video. And if it wins people over, then it does. And if it doesn't, then it doesn't. And I just have to recognize that. And maybe other people are going to base morality off of things other than reason alone, like certain commitments of their faith. And I think there are positions in epistemic space on which that can be a perfectly rational response to certain bodies of evidence. It's just I myself don't occupy those bodies of evidence. I have different intellectual seemings, different books read, different sorts of things like that. And this all just goes to the fact that justification is kind of person dependent. It depends on like whether or not someone is justified in accepting something is going to depend on a whole concoction of individual specific factors, like what books they've read, what papers they've read, their plausibility structures, their intuitions, their bodies of testimonial evidence, which vastly differ across people. So we all have different evidence bases. And so I can just go off what seems plausible to me. And at least the general arguments that I've been mounting here are the ones that seem plausible to me, whether or not they convince most people. But I do appreciate the comment, and I think it's a call really to intellectual humility.
All right, Joe, it's been such a delight to have you. I got to let you go, but thank you to all the audience members who are watching. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all your questions, but time is tight. And so with that, I'm going to promptly end the episode, but I'll have like notes in the description, and please check out Joe's channel, Majesty of Reason. And with that, we are going to sign off.